our science lesson today, we shall continue our discussions of Darwin's theory, the descent of man. As I told you yesterday, Darwin's theory tells us that we evolved from a lower order of animals, from the first wriggling protozoa in the sea, to the ape, and finally to man.
You are charged with violation of Public Act 31428, Volume 37, State Code, which makes it unlawful for any teacher of the public schools to teach any theory that denies the creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man is descended from a lower order of animals. I hereby place you under arrest. The American martyr was born this morning.
A heat wave had hit Dayton, Tennessee, the summer of 1925. But it was more than the weather that heated up the conversations around the country that July. It was the trial of the century at the Ray County Courthouse. Teacher John Scopes stood accused of violating a Tennessee law that said Charles Darwin's theory of evolution could not be taught in the classroom. John Scopes' attorney, the famous Clarence Darrow, argued that if Darwin's theory could not be taught, academic freedom would be crushed under the feet of religious bigotry.
If you can take something like evolution and make it a crime to teach it in a public school, then tomorrow you can make it a crime to teach it in a private school. And next year you can make it a crime to read about it. And then maybe you can start banning books and newspapers. And soon you may set Catholic against Protestant, Protestant against Protestant, and try to foist your own brand of religion upon the mind of man. If you can do one, you can do the other. And soon, Your Honor, with banners waving and drums beating, we are marching backwards to the glorious 16th century, when bigots condemned Galileo for daring to bring intelligence and enlightenment to the human mind.
The defense strategy was to portray this as an exercise in bigotry and superstition against science and rationality. The defense had brought experts to come in and testify, and I suppose what they hoped to do was just embarrass the judge and the jurors into an acquittal, or if they didn't get that, win the case in the newspapers.
The great orator Darrow was eloquent. He put quite a spin on his client's case as he argued that the law barring the teaching of evolution was violating the separation of church and state.
It wasn't just people who take the Bible too literally against people with a little bit broader view. It was whether there's a creator who brought about our existence for a purpose against, no. It's material processes that are mindless and purposeless, and life has no inherent purpose.
William Jennings Bryan countered with the state's case.
He has been taught that he wriggled up like an animal out of the filth and the muck below. I tell you, these Bible haters, these evolutionists, are brewers of poison. If this law is not upheld, this boy will find himself one of a generation shorn of its faith by the teachings of godless science.
Once Bryan was there, he was set up for ridicule on every point. That was Darrow's main objective. After all, the Bible is full of supernatural events, and such events are, from a scientific materialist perspective, absurdities. So all Darrow had to do was bring that out and ridicule him, and he was an expert at that.
For 15 days, the nation hung on the words of the press as they printed a distorted account of the trial.
This is the very courtroom where John Scopes stood trial. More than 1,000 people, including 200 journalists, crowded into this room in the summer heat for that historic event. So many reporters and onlookers were jammed into the courtroom that at one point Judge John Ralston moved the entire proceedings to the courthouse lawn just outside this room. That intense media coverage threw the creation-evolution debate onto the front pages and across the nation for the first time. Plus, Chicago's WGN Radio covered the entire trial live and related to other stations around the country. The whole world looked on through the eyes of the media. Now, when I say that, I hope you caught the significance of the last part of my statement. I said the whole world looked on through the eyes of the media. The story that developed in this courtroom, in this small Tennessee town, where relatively few people saw firsthand what happened, was told all right, but through the eyes, through the filter through the censorship of a very biased minority. Just by looking at the O.J. trial, the President Bill Clinton's impeachment trial, and our nation's elections, you can get some idea of how reporters can put a spin on a subject. The spin doctors.
Even if Governor Bush does win, he's going to have a hard time getting his agenda through.
It's time to do away with the Electoral College.
I guess Hillary has not really studied the history of this country.
Trent Lott had urged Mrs. Clinton to go slowly.
You made the point, you said, I can never imagine Newt Gingrich saying Democrats want the best for our nation, and I have to say, I agree with that.
The spin doctors. Their job is to sway public opinion and to ignore any facts that would hinder them from doing so. Well, that's exactly what happened once the news media started reporting on the Scopes trial and evolution back in 1925.
The so-called religious organizations which now lead the war against the teaching of evolution are nothing more at bottom than conspiracies of the inferior man against his betters. They mirror very accurately his congenital hatred of knowledge, his bitter enmity to the man who knows more than he does, and so gets more out of life. H.L. Mencken, Baltimore Evening Sun, June 29, 1925.
And not much has changed, because even today, the media, which represents a relatively small percentage of people with their own agenda, puts their own spin on the information that's given to the rest of us. And they very tightly control this and many other subjects. Let me give you just two quick examples of exactly how the media spin worked in the case of the Scopes monkey trial and evolution. The Scopes trial inspired a play and the movie Inherit the Wind. But Inherit the Wind was not true to what actually happened here in Dayton, Tennessee. In the movie version, 24-year-old John Scopes was portrayed as a teacher fighting for the right to explain the truth of Darwin's theory to his students.
I'm just a school teacher, but I feel I have been convicted of violating an unjust law.
The press painted him as the hero fighting for justice. But the real story is something altogether different. In reality, the American Civil Liberties Union had advertised for a teacher who was willing to test the law forbidding the teaching of evolution. The then unknown Scopes volunteered, and the town of Dayton rallied to support him. Scopes later admitted that because he was only a substitute teacher in science, he had probably never even taught Darwin's idea. Watch this clip from the movie and ask yourself who's portrayed as the bad guy and the bigot.
There are many portions of the Holy Bible I have committed to memory.
I don't suppose you've memorized many passages from the Origin of Species?
I have not the least interest in the pagan hypotheses of that book.
Oh, you mean you never read it?
And I never will.
Then where in perdition do you get the gall to whoop up this holy war against something you know nothing about? How can you be so cocksure that the body of scientific knowledge systematized in Charles Darwin's writings is in any way irreconcilable with the spirit of the book of Genesis?
It's pretty obvious who was portrayed as the bad guy and the bigot in the movie version of what happened. The character, teacher John Scopes, along with his attorney, Clarence Darrow, are portrayed as heroes, fighting for truth and what is right, everything we believe in as a nation. The character portraying attorney William Jennings Bryan, who prosecuted Scopes and defended the biblical view of creation against evolution, is portrayed as the ignorant religious bigot. Well, when this program is over, I think it will become clear that it is precisely the opposite. The media in that movie falsely portray the participants involved and spread inaccuracies about the events that took place. But even more frightening is the outrageous lie that's been spoon-fed to the American public and the world, portraying evolution and science as truth and the Bible as mere mythology, when all along it's been exactly the opposite.
The great masses of the people will more easily fall victims to a big lie than to a small one. The greater the lie, the more readily it will be believed. Adolf Hitler.
I can't get past the evidence. I can't get past the proof. I can't get past the evidence. It's impossible to do. You all see that I can't deny the truth. I can't get.
I think that we evolved from animals.
I believe in creation. I don't believe in the story of creation. I do believe in most of the Bible, though. I believe in creation.
No idea. Creation. I believe in creation. We look similar to apes.
I believe in God.
I think it's a mystery. It's not for humans to know. I think that evolution probably is very valid, but I also like to believe in creation.
I started leaning towards the evolution idea, but there's no power in it like there is in the power of God.
For the remainder remainder of this program, we're going to put you right here, where I'm sitting, in the juror's box. But this time you're going to hear the facts about evolution versus creation. Not some media spin, not wishful thinking, not the biased view of a scientific minority. Just a plain old-fashioned expose on the facts. Here's what I'm going to ask you to do. Check the facts yourself. Don't do what most of us do, which is to give in to our natural tendency to act like cattle and just follow the herd. Don't take my word for it, but do me one other favor as well. Stop taking the media and evolutionists' word for it also. You know, when you stop to think about it, it's kind of sad, really, because we've grown so accustomed to just taking the word of any intelligent man in a lab coat with a doctor in front of his name that we've forgotten how to think for ourselves. And I assure you the facts I'm talking about are easy to prove. In fact, some basic common sense will do it, because the truth is, you've been misled, scammed, lied to. You've let the evolutionists make a monkey out of you, and now it's time to turn the tables. I'm going to expose 10 outright lies, 10 myths that have been fed to the American public by a very small percentage of people and organizations with an agenda all their own. And sadly, many of the rest of us have followed along blindly. We've grown up with years and years of being brainwashed with junk science. And because the people who have told us these seem like such smart people, we simply accepted it on face value. Well, it's time to take a hard look at the facts. What's even more ironic is that the Bible, which has been portrayed as a book of myths that requires blind and unintelligent faith, can be proven to be 100% accurate. In fact, we did that very thing in a number of programs at the beginning of this very series. Programs like Proving the Bible Through Archaeology and The Proof of Prophecy. If you have any doubts that the Bible is what it claims to be, a book inspired by God Himself, then I ask you to get a copy of those programs and watch them. And once you've seen the scientific, archaeological, and prophetic evidence that the Bible can be totally trusted, then the words that you're about to see on your screen, words that are written in the pages of the Bible, words that are from God, not men, will shock you.
The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified Him as God, nor gave thanks to Him. But their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised.
Think about those words for a minute. Men who suppress the truth, they are without excuse, because God's creation is plain to see. Yet men exchange the glory of God for images of animals and birds. They exchange the truth of God for a lie. And so God turned them over to the sinful desires of their hearts. Let me warn you, just as those words from Holy Scripture do, there will be no claiming ignorance before God. Nobody will be able to say, I didn't know, or it wasn't my fault, or I was wrong because I believed the scientists, since they were smarter than I was, and I thought they had more evidence. God stated very clearly, if you really want to know the truth about the existence of God, you can.
All you have to do is look around, and you will see in my creation that I exist, and that because there is creation, common sense will tell you that there first must have been a creator.
So let's examine the facts for ourselves. And I want you to bring your brain and your conscience and leave your prejudices, your prejudgments, your preconceived notions behind.
Cause I can't get past the evidence. I can't get past the proof.
One of the classic myths that the spin doctors have managed to sway popular opinion with over the years is that evolution is somehow a fact of science. They work very hard at creating this image, that this intellectual approach to life is waging a noble fight for truth against all those narrow-minded bigots who blindly believe in religion. Well, if evolution is a scientific fact, then it might surprise you to hear that a scientist from Pensacola, Florida, Dr. Ken Hovind, has a standing offer of $250,000, and I quote, to anyone who can give any, and I emphasize any, empirical evidence for evolution. That's right. You understood that correctly. Since 1990, Dr. Hovind has offered any and all takers the opportunity to provide any scientific proof for evolution. If anyone ever could, he would immediately hand over $250,000. And guess what? Despite newspaper articles and cover stories on National Geographic all about those evolutionary proofs, Dr. Hovind's $250,000 is still safely in his own hands. How can that be? Well, you see, evolution is a theory, not a scientific fact as it's generally considered to be, and it's often portrayed by many of our school textbooks and in museums. In fact, if you want to be scientifically accurate about it, evolution doesn't even qualify to be a theory, despite the fact that it's the term most commonly used for it. No, in reality, it's not a theory at all. It's a model. That's because scientific theories have to be observed, tested, and the results repeated. But evolution has never been observed. No one was there when life first appeared on this planet. Nor can evolution be tested. Chemists have never been able to create life from non-living matter. And despite the countless millions of species that scientists claim were involved in our past, mysteriously, evolution has never repeated in modern history, or at any other point in recorded history. Ken Ham, a former science teacher who now heads up the organization Answers in Genesis, explains.
To say to them, hey, you told us to trust the scientists got it wrong. They've changed their theories. But you know what? The Word of God hasn't changed. Why didn't you tell us to trust the Word of God? And so I think there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from the Scopes trial. So when people tell us, I often hear secular scientists say, creation, evolution, that issue was resolved at the Scopes trial. Wait a minute. Do you realize most of the evidence for evolution back then, today, is no longer accepted by evolutionists at all? No, we need to learn the lesson of the Scopes trial.
So it would be a gross exaggeration, at best, to state, or even imply, that evolution is a scientific fact. Let me show you how the myths about evolution, having been proven, are created.
Almost all science textbooks include England's peppered moth as the classic example of evolution by natural selection. The theory says that dark and light-colored moths rested on tree trunks during the day, and birds ate them. But on trees covered with a whitish-colored fungus, the light moths were able to survive because they were camouflaged. When the Industrial Revolution hit, pollution and dark soot reversed the effects.
There was a scientific hypothesis that in periods where the trees of a forest were darkened by industrial smoke, moths which were dark in color would be better able to survive because the birds wouldn't be able to see them. And light-colored moths would be eaten more often, and so for a time you would get more dark moths and fewer light moths in a population.
Scientists who believed in the myth of evolution gloated over this, saying the results proved that evolution by natural selection is true. The problem is, peppered moths don't rest on tree trunks during the day. After more than 40 years of intense field study, only 2 peppered moths have ever been seen naturally resting on tree trunks. It seems this clear case of Darwinian evolution by natural selection is just one more example of wishful thinking and scientific blunders.
So where did all the evolution textbook get pictures of peppered moths on different colored tree trunks? You'll probably be amazed to discover just how far this media spin was taken by scientists who wanted to believe their own story. They were all staged. The moths were glued, pinned, placed into tree trunks, and their pictures taken. The scientists who used the pictures in their books to prove evolution all conveniently forgot to tell their readers that little subtle fact. If the best example of evolution that has ever been documented has been used as proof by eminent evolutionary biologists for more than 40 years is not true, then how about all of their other supposed examples? Kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? You see, the problem is Darwin's ideas were merely that, ideas, not facts. And what most people don't know is that Darwin himself expressed doubts about his own ideas.
Firstly, why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. Charles Darwin.
Even today, scientists around the world are finally beginning to ask, how could we have so willingly swallowed such an improbable lie? It's a little hard to imagine. Well, how about the Bible, you ask? Is the Bible in conflict with science? The answer is no. But evolutionists are ultimately forced to take that stance because their theories are in conflict with what the Bible teaches. And yet, the truth is, the Bible is full of scientific facts. And the so-called science of evolution is the one that over time has proven itself to be the one that simply cannot stand up to scrutiny. Do you like being on the cutting edge of knowledge? The Bible has always been years ahead of scientists and is one of the most advanced science books around. In its pages are the answers to the mysteries of life and the invisible laws of the universe.
Astronomers believe that there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 6,000 stars. This held in the science of astronomy until Galileo came along with his telescope, and suddenly science realized that the stars of the heaven are innumerable. Billions of galaxies, billions of stars in these galaxies, innumerable, just like God said to Abraham way back in Genesis, the first book of the Bible.
In the book of Jonah we read, "The water compassed me about, even to the soul. The depth closed me round about. The weeds were wrapped about my head. I went down to the bottoms of the mountains." In this amazing verse, we are told that there are mountains on the ocean floor. Yet scientists did not know this until this century. In the book of Job, Job proclaims that God hangs the earth on nothing. While many holy books declared that the earth sits on the backs of turtles or elephants, or is held up by Atlas, the Bible alone declares what we now know to be true. Many other scientific insights were revealed in the Bible centuries before man discovered them. For example, atomic fission, oceanic currents, the hydrologic cycle, the jet stream, dinosaurs, and innumerable stars.
We know that when Columbus made his trip to discover India and landed here in America, that when he took off, there was tremendous fears that he would come to the edge of the earth and would plunge off into nothing. And yet, had they read the Bible, they would have known that Isaiah talks about the circle of the earth, and that the earth is actually round.
I challenge anyone to find scientific errors in the Bible. They're not there.
What's fascinating to me is the more you know about the Scripture and the more you know about contemporary science, you discover the Bible has anticipated it.
As a Christian, we can believe in creation and the laws of science at the same time. And as a scientist, I'd a lot rather believe a theory that fits with the evidence that we can really see.
Always, whenever we study, whenever we really can observe, we'll see that science supports God's Word.
I would challenge those who are declaring that the Bible is filled with myths to investigate for yourself with an open mind, and I know you'll discover the truth.
The real problem with Darwin's model of evolution is that Charles Darwin just failed to uncover the real evidence. Evidence that would have shown how wrong his ideas really were. Evidence that is surfacing every day. So what exactly did Charles Darwin write that divided the scientific world in 1859? In his book, Origin of the Species, he suggested that animals, including man, have all descended from a common ancestor, from simple marine organisms. Darwin wanted us to believe that simple organisms turned into fish, and then amphibians, part sea, part land animals, then reptiles, then mammals, primates, or apes, and finally humans. Basically, his theory was that man descended from a sludge pool over millions of years, and that our most recent ancestors are apes. And that flatly contradicts the Bible's account in Genesis, that each species, including humans, were created individually. Now, of course, evolutionary adaptation does occur within the same species. In other words, certain birds develop characteristics over time that help them adapt to their environment.
There's a certain amount of selection. You'll get variation. Finches that
migrated to an island in the Galapagos group did vary and change. But they're still finches. They got there as finches, and they still are finches with variations.
If you take two medium finches with medium-sized beaks and you breed them, you will get some finches with small beaks and some finches with larger beaks. Over time, as these finches spread out into the various environments, certain beak sizes would be favored in certain environments, and therefore they would become the predominant type. But the point is the capability to produce the small beaks, the medium beaks, and the large beaks was already in the parent population of the Galapagos finches, and it was simply the environmental differences that allowed them to be expressed. It was not the creation of any new and unique information.
But cats don't become dogs, and apes don't become humans. And you know, Darwin's attempt to deny God's part in creation wasn't new. His ideas actually came from early pagan Greek philosophers. So all those scientists who are so proud of the scientific heritage of evolution really ought to trace it all the way back to its rather embarrassing roots. And when you do, you'll find out just how ridiculous it gets. As those early philosophers envisioned the universe coming out of chaos, which then produced the first goddess, Earth, they believed the goddess then created the god of the heavens, who became her husband. Not very scientific, is it? The idea that man descended from a lower life form reappeared in the Middle Ages, during the 15th century. The problem was that no one could explain how it could happen. One species did not seem to be able to become another species. But men who wanted to remove a creator god from the picture always fantasized over the possibility of creating some plausible explanation that didn't require God. But then in 1859, Darwin's theory seemed to provide the answer. It was a way of saying there could somehow be intelligent design without intelligence. And at the core, that was Darwin's real objective, to explain life without the creator God in the equation. The problem was, science then, as well as science today, contradicts it. Darwin was hoping someone somewhere would prove what he had dreamed up in his head could be found in actual physical evidence. Listen to what Darwin wrote.
I was a young man with unformed ideas. I threw out queries, suggestions, wondering all the time over everything, and to my astonishment, the ideas took like wildfire. People made a religion out of them.
But what looked good to some on paper hasn't translated into fact.
The truth is, evolution relies on blind faith and hoaxes like the peppered moth. Those who look into the pages of the Bible find that the mysteries of science have long been recorded there.
Darwin said that he believed the fossil record would show transitional species, like the long sought-after missing link, a creature that would be something more than an ape, but less than a human. Darwin knew his thoughts about evolution would stand or fall on whether or not these in-between links existed. In fact, it was Darwin himself who warned, unless transitional forms could be found in the fossil record, the theory of evolution is worthless speculation. In other words, if evolution was ever going to be proven to be true, it would first have to find fossils that showed these in-between links between various species actually existed. He speculated that when these intermediate fossils were found, they would clearly show the steps from one species to the next. That means there would be fossil records of very strange-looking creatures. Fish with beginnings of legs, reptiles with primitive wings, and ape-like creatures with human characteristics.
Of course, my favorite is a platypus. And the reason the platypus is my favorite is because it was discovered in 1797 and sent back to the British Museum, and the British scientists actually thought that some taxidermist had cut up all these different animals and stuck them all back together again, because they got this funny-looking creature that had a bill like a duck and a beaver-like tail and hair like a bear and webbed feet like an otter and claws like a reptile, laid eggs like a turtle, feeds a shung of milk like a mammal, has spurs like a rooster and poison like a snake. Now, if you found an animal like that, you'd think somebody had stitched all these animals together. But in actual fact, this is a beautifully designed little creature. And you see, the interesting thing is this. If you're going to believe in evolution and believe one kind of animal changed into another, and here you have one that has features of reptiles, birds, and mammals, you have to believe it almost evolved from everything. But the reason it's my favorite creature is because I think every time an evolutionist looks at the platypus, I think God smiles because I think he made it just for them.
The problem is, no intermediate fossils have ever been found. That's right, you heard me correctly. Not a single intermediate fossil has ever been found. since in theory there would be millions of them. That's a pretty amazing fact. Yes, it appears the missing link is, well, still missing. There's not even a single example of an intermediate fish. Over the years, there have been claims by scientists that such creatures exist. Surely you've seen them in books and magazines and on TV. But when examined, the results have always been the same. The physical evidence, the scientific evidence, shows that the creatures are always nothing more than a member of a complete species, and not a transitional intermediate species at all. And despite the fact that there are drawings of such intermediate creatures in your children's textbooks, amazingly, not a single one is a genuine, tangible example. Not only that, the fossil evidence shows that new species appeared suddenly, abruptly, out of nothing, just like the Bible says in the book of Genesis.
The key problem with Darwinism is finding hard physical evidence. Where would you look for that evidence? Well, obviously in the rocks, in the record of the rocks, the fossil record. Fossils have been collected for hundreds of years, for centuries. There are billions of fossils in every university and every museum in the world. But there are no intermediate species. You look at one strata and you find one kind of fossil. You look at the strata above it and you find a different kind of fossil. What you don't find is a gradual change.
One of the greatest evidences for creation is found in the fossil record. For example, in the so-called Cambrian rocks, we find fossils of a vast array of very complex invertebrates: clams, snails, jellyfish, worms, brachiopods, trilobites, and many other very complex invertebrates. But nowhere on the face of this earth has anyone found fossilized ancestor to a single one of those complex invertebrates. Now that fact alone demolishes the theory of evolution. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about appears fully formed, no trace of ancestors, and certainly no trace of transitional forms linking these major kind of fishes to one another. Now that fact is known. Evolutionists know that.
There's certainly no transitional form out there that proves that life evolved or anything like that. The coelacanth fish for many years was considered transitional between fish and amphibians because it had these bony structures that looked like, well, maybe it's evolving legs, and it had these structures that it was going to walk on the ocean floor and so on. Well, then what happened was that they found out that fishermen had been pulling up these fish live in their nets off the coast of Madagascar for years. Recently they found them in Indonesia in the fish markets as well, and realized these fish are alive and happy swimming around the world today. They're a lobe-fin fish, and the little structures that they thought were evolving legs and so on are actually their lobe fins that enable the fish to be like a helicopter in the water. It's got incredible mobility, and so no longer do they think that the coelacanth is a transitional form.
Evolutionists still insist there are transitional forms, then contradict themselves and say they just haven't been found yet. Dr. Leo Hickey of Yale University.
There's really no problem finding transitional forms.
Then he says just a few minutes later,
evolution acts in very short bursts. It doesn't leave many transitional forms behind.
Or Preston Cloud, an evolutionist and geologist, who said,
there are so many transitional forms between species that we must often fall back on statistical analysis to separate one from the other.
Then said,
the problem of transitional forms is one that all honest paleontologists have a problem with. The geologic record is incomplete.
Over and over again, it's the Bible that's been shown to be right. Because the Bible tells us that God made distinct kinds of animals and plants to reproduce after their own kind, great variation within a kind. You see that in natural selection, which is not evolution, by the way. It just operates within a kind.
Dr. Colin Patterson of the British Museum of Natural History wrote to aerospace engineer Luther Sunderland, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one might make a watertight argument. It is easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another, and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection. But such stories are not part of science, for there is no way to put them to the test. Fossils may tell us many things, but one thing they can never disclose is whether they were ancestors of anything else.
The evolutionists realize that they can no longer rely on the fossil record to give them any support. So what they've done is they've come up with a very crafty alternative to the Darwinian concept of evolution. They call it punctuated equilibrium.
The theory says evolution is stable for long periods of time. Then new species suddenly come into being, and others immediately become extinct.
You see, this solves all kinds of problems intellectually for the evolutionist. He doesn't have to look at the fossil record.
I'm convinced that the idea of punctuated equilibria is really a desperate attempt to salvage evolutionary theory. There is no evidence in the fossil record that one type of animal ever changed into another type of animal. Punctuated equilibria comes along and says that isolated populations of animals evolved rapidly and left no fossil trace. But this is an argument from lack of data. There are no transitional forms, and that's used then as proof of the brand of evolution called punctuated equilibria. This is bad science.
Geneticist Richard Goldschmidt agrees species appeared suddenly, but he still could not admit it was because God created everything. Instead, he came up with the hopeful monster theory, which says a reptile laid an egg and a bird crawled out.
What it does say to us is that the evolutionists are running scared. It seems like almost every new development in science is converging to destroy evolution. And that's true. Regardless of whether we're talking about new discoveries in astronomy or paleontology or biology, this is true. In the last decade, most of the basic pillars upon which evolution has stood have collapsed, and the theory is now in chaos. Unfortunately, at this time, the evolutionists are crying louder than ever before that evolution is a fact.
If evolution was true, we wouldn't be concerned about the extinction of species. There'd be new ones being created. We don't have new species. We got deterioration. We have all kinds of species that no longer exist.
Evolution is not only based on faith, but blind faith at that.
The truth is, there are no examples of evolution in the fossil record, no intermediate transitional species. Out of the millions of fossils found in more than 150 years, the only thing we see are complete species.
Let's consider the case of human beings. Evolutionists say humans came from apes. For years, some scientists tried to pass off certain fossil discoveries as the missing link between the two species. The problem is, every last case was shown to be either a fraud or an error.
Darwin's answer is that we and modern apes have evolved from some common ape-like ancestor millions of years in the past.
Dr. Donald Johanson, director of the Institute of Human Origins at Arizona State University, discovered Lucy, an alleged ape-to-man missing link. Here's what Dr. Johanson said in a NOVA program on PBS.
I was headed back to my Land Rover. It was about noontime, and I was going to drive back to camp. And I just happened to look over my right shoulder, and I noticed a small piece of bone resting on the surface of the ground. And as I began to look around and scan the slope, I could see not only bits of a leg, but bits of a skull, a little piece of a jaw. And I realized right there in that noonday sun that what I had literally stumbled across was most of an entire skeleton.
Here was the skeleton of a creature that looked like it could walk like us, but with many ape-like features. The ape that stood up, it was a revolutionary idea.
It was a revolutionary idea, all right. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out to be a missing link, though Johanson still claims it is.
Lucy has been restored in museums around the world to look like a human ancestor. She's usually given a sort of an ape-like face and a human-like body, human hands, human feet. The truth is that Lucy's bones are actually those of an extinct arboreal ape. Many anthropologists who've examined Australopithecus remains have come to the conclusion that it's nothing more than an extinct ape.
The knee joint would hint that Lucy was human. But what the evolutionists don't tell you is that the knee joint was found about a mile away and almost 200 feet deeper than the other bones. That means the knee belonged to another creature, a human, while the rest of the bones were from an extinct ape.
For it to be a missing link, fossils would have to show that the intermediate creatures had the capacity to make tools and walk erect, quality humans possess. Yet no such fossils have ever been found.
Walking upright is something that only humans can do, and it needs a special kind of knee joint. One that can be locked straight. A chimp gets around on all fours. If it tries to walk upright, its knee joint doesn't lock. It's forced to walk with a bent leg, and that's tiring.
So the evolutionist has to somehow find an animal that has at least the latent capacity to make tools, walk erect, and a relatively large brain.
But at this point, you must be thinking, what about all those displays at the museums? The pictures of an ape gradually becoming upright, like a man. I've seen those with my own eyes.
Even though museums around the world show displays of half men, half apes as the missing links, they aren't real. Like here at London's Natural History Museum. Listen to Dr. Chris Stringer, a paleoanthropologist at the museum.
We think that humans separated from apes about 5 million years ago, although there is not fossil evidence of that period of separation. Although there is not fossil evidence of that period of separation.
Scientists and artists who support evolution continue to dupe the public with imaginary drawings showing ape-like figures turning into humans. They make up hair color, skin tones, and facial expressions from no more than a tooth, a piece of bone, or even no evidence at all. The fact is, there is clear evidence of apes, and there is clear evidence of human beings, but no one has ever found an ape man.
Workers in the field have, over the past 100 years, provided lots of missing links, or have offered us lots of skeletons as being missing links. What's happened in every case is that once the headlines have died down after the announcement of the discovery, serious researchers have investigated the finds, and they've found that either the fossil in question was an extinct ape or it was an extinct human.
And there's more fraud and error. Nebraska man and his entire family were reconstructed from a single tooth, from an extinct pig. One so-called ape-man discovery, called Piltdown Man, passed as authentic for 44 years before experts discovered it was a fraud. It turns out someone had taken the skull of a human and combined it with the jaw of an ape, an orangutan, then filed down its teeth and artificially colored the whole thing with chemicals to make it look older. Anthropologists first said it was 500,000 years old. But when they tested the discovery years later, they found the jawbone actually belonged to an ape who had died 50 years earlier. Once researchers really investigated the facts, they found that the fossils were either an ape or a human, or an outright fraud, but no missing links. Like the fossil remains dubbed Homo habilis. Here's what Dr. Stringer, an evolutionist, has to say about it.
Yes, habilis is a problem taxon. I think there are at least 2 species represented.
And creationists agree.
Homo habilis was made up of at least 2, if not more, different groups that do not belong together. It was an assemblage of several different types of animals put together and made into one.
Homo erectus, or Java man, isn't a half-man, half-ape either. The man who discovered it admitted before he died that it was a fraud. He confessed that he had found an ape skull about 50 feet away from a human leg and 2 human skulls, and had mixed and matched to create a fictitious creature. Both creationists and evolutionists now admit Neanderthal man is a human. Scientists from Johns Hopkins University x-rayed the bones and found it was a human male stooped over from rickets or arthritis. So where are the missing links, showing changes from lower life forms of apes to that of humans? They've never been found, because they don't exist. More than 1 million species exist today. Scientists have discovered fossils from 88% of those species, but they have never found one fossil showing an intermediate species trying to change into another completely different species. But that hasn't stopped evolutionists. They've resorted to some horrifying methods of finding that non-existing link.
The Australian Aborigines were once taught to be the missing links in history, and they were even listed as animals in the early 1900s in the Sydney Museum booklet. And in fact, many people don't realize this, but scientists sent people from Germany and other parts of the world, England and so on, to Australia to hunt down the Aborigines. They paid property owners money to go onto their properties, herd them over cliffs, herd them into swamps, men, women and children, shoot them, boil up their skulls, skin them, even had instructions on how to plug the bullet holes to send specimens to museums around the world because they were considered the missing links. In fact, in 1924, the New York Tribune newspaper that then existed had a headline article about the missing links found in Australia, the Australian Aborigines. Even in America's history, for instance, the United States, in 1904, a pygmy that was brought from South Africa for the World's Fair in St. Louis, at the end of the World's Fair, was taken to the Bronx Zoo, and because of the evolutionary beliefs of the director of the zoo and the explorer that brought the pygmy over from Africa, they put him in a monkey cage with an orangutan to show a relationship, a supposed relationship, to the people of America, and the pygmy in the zoo became the most popular exhibit at the zoo, with Americans lining up in long lines to get in to see the pygmy in the zoo.
The truth is, Australia's Aborigines believe they were created by God. Here's what one Aborigine told Dr. Johansson about their origins and how they've memorialized it in cave drawings.
Everything he created himself. And he picked up that mud, red, and he made one man like man and a woman. He said, all that due to woman, and it make him more people to fill this country. Telling you this story, what generation been start off, and you got to keep this generation keep going. Other place, other world, you got to should be teach same way, why he was before us.
The truth is, the missing link between ape and man is still missing because it doesn't exist.
I can't get past the evidence. It's impossible to do. You want to reason.
Current theory on the origin of the universe is that there was an event that took place, we call it the Big Bang. Prior to about 1/100th of a second after this event took place, we really can't go back that far.
Physicists say the universe came out of nothing in a single burst of light that created an environment receptive to carbon-based life. The Bible says that too, in the book of Genesis. Some evolutionists say the light which suddenly formed everything in the universe was an explosion called the Big Bang. They say that explosion created all the order we see today. The Bible agrees that the universe came into being suddenly, not by an explosion, but by an act of God. Evolution can't say what or who created the universe. But where did that first matter and energy in the universe come from?
There was energy there. Well, where did the energy come from? And so there's a point where you can't go back any further. You just have to say, I quit.
When a universe just suddenly comes into existence, the known laws of science go out the door. British physicist Stephen Hawking stated the obvious conclusion that we'd all have to concede if we're honest.
So long as the universe had a beginning, we could suppose it had a creator.
Exactly. The Bible says God created the universe, all the life in it, all the chemicals, and then set in motion the laws of science.
Did the Big Bang trigger the formation of galaxies, stars, planets, and ultimately life?
Is there any order coming out of a big explosion? I would say not in any way. Explosions cause chaos and random distribution of various parts that were there perhaps as a united organization beforehand. Any explosion renders that completely null and void. There is no evidence to my mind that an explosion or even the Big Bang Theory can ultimately produce organized beings like ourselves or any other animal.
See, the whole Big Bang idea really is first there was nothing, and then it exploded.
Think about it. Have you ever heard of an explosion that has produced order? Do you understand what I'm asking you? The question is, can a bomb from a terrorist form a Rolex watch from the various materials available in the area when it explodes? Of course not. It's absurd to even consider. And yet, that's basically what scientists have tried to convince themselves in an effort to come to a conclusion. Any conclusion other than a divine God created the universe. Would you like to try your own scientific experiment? To prove the Big Bang Theory is possible, here's what you need to do. First, empty your garage of every piece of metal, wood, leather, paint, rubber, and plastic. Sweep it clean. There can't be a single element present that would normally be used in making a car. Nothing. Now, wait for 10 years and see if a Mercedes-Benz spontaneously forms in your garage. That doesn't work. Wait it for 20 years. That doesn't work. Maybe 100. Maybe it's 10,000 or 250 million. Because that's what it takes to have the same blind faith that you would need to believe that evolution and the Big Bang Theory formed life from absolutely nothing.
Science can find no force in nature that might account for the beginning of the universe, and it can find no evidence that the universe even existed before that moment. Scientists have no proof that life was not the result of an act of creation. To their chagrin, they have no clear-cut answer. The astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are alike in one essential respect. There was a beginning, and all things in the universe can be traced back to it. Robert Justro, agnostic, founder of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies.
What do you have to believe in order to believe in Darwin's theory of evolution? Well, before any of the other contradictions we've already discussed about the process itself, you have to believe that the beginning of the universe happened all by itself. Every complex organism, every spectacularly designed planet, every remarkable creature, including the entire universe and galaxies of planets and solar systems that operate in perfect clockwork precision, all happened without a creator. You have to believe it was all formed from an explosion. To make note of this, you'll have to believe that it was all formed from an explosion out of absolutely nothing. Now that's blind faith.
If the sun, planets, and moons evolved from the same material, they should have many similarities. Yet each planet is unique. Since about 98% of the sun is hydrogen or helium, Earth, Mars, Venus, and Mercury should have similar compositions. Instead, much less than 1% of these planets is hydrogen or helium. If the solar system evolved, all planets should spin in the same direction. But Pluto and Venus rotate backwards, while Uranus is tipped on its side and rotates like a wheel. All moons in our solar system should orbit their planets in the same sense. But at least 6 have backward orbits. Furthermore, Neptune, Saturn, and Jupiter have moons orbiting in both directions. Growing a planet by many small collisions will produce an almost non-spinning planet, since the impacts will be largely self-canceling. Yet, all planets spin, some much more than others. Growing a large, distant gaseous planet such as Jupiter or Saturn poses an insurmountable hurdle for evolutionists, because gases dissipate rapidly in the vacuum of outer space. And even young stars, similar to our Sun, do not have enough orbiting hydrogen or helium to form even one Jupiter. Scientists have no answer as to why 4 planets have rings, or why each planet is so unique. Theories on the moon's origin are also completely inadequate. The moon's elements are too dissimilar to those of Earth's, and its orbital plane and circular orbit offer strong evidence that the moon was created in its present orbit.
There is no evidence that the planetary system could have come about by mechanical means. However, the more that scientists began to look at the amazing universe that they inhabited, they began to realize that there were certain factors that were simply very, very fine-tuned for the existence of man, of molecules, of organic life. And the more they looked, the more they realized that we are in effect on really quite a knife edge, and there are many, many indications that this universe has been very specially designed, and man is at the very center of it.
If we try to model the universe as we know it, as we try to build a mathematical model that reflects what we know, we quickly discover there are thousands of parameters and ratios that if you adjust them even a little bit, life is impossible. We quickly discover that the Earth was a little closer, a little further from the Sun. It's either too warm or too cold. If it turns at a little different speed, if the masses are a little different, it would hold too much or too little atmosphere. As you start trying to model this, you quickly discover that all the parameters involve an incredibly delicate balance.
The truth is, the world didn't begin with a mindless, meaningless explosion called the Big Bang. The world began when God created it.
You see, God gave you and me a conscience. Then He gave us an entire universe that speaks of order and design, and unimaginable complexity. And that speaks undeniably of a creator. Evolution is a lie, and the fact that you and I are created by and responsible to a creator God is an obvious fact. So really, now I'm talking to those holdouts who consider themselves to be scientific and intellectual. This is really not about convincing your intellect. It's about setting aside your pride and listening to your conscience. And it's mostly about bending your knee to the creator God of the universe. Evolution is nothing more than an elaborate path that some men have devised to suppress the truth so they can run away from God. Don't let men who are suppressing the truth by their wickedness rob you of the glory and blessing of knowing and living for and being blessed by the God who created you. I'm Janet Folger. May God bless you and keep you.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
In Part 1, we examined 4 lies about evolution and showed how scientific evidence has disproved them. Here's a summary of those 4.
For our science lesson today, we shall continue our discussions of Darwin's theory, the descent of man. As I told you yesterday, Darwin's theory tells us that we evolved from a lower order of animals, from the first wriggling protozoa in the sea, to the ape, and finally to man.
You are charged with violation of Public Act 31428, Volume 37, State Code, which makes it unlawful for any teacher of the public schools to teach any theory that denies the creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. I hereby place you under arrest.
The American martyr was born this morning.
A heat wave had hit Dayton, Tennessee, the summer of 1925. But it was more than the weather that heated up the conversations around the country that July. It was the trial of the century at the Ray County Courthouse. Teacher John Scopes stood accused of violating a Tennessee law that said Charles Darwin's theory of evolution could not be taught in the classroom. For 15 days, the nation hung on the words of the press as they printed a distorted account of the trial.
This is the very courtroom where John Scopes stood trial. More than 1,000 people, including 200 journalists, crowded into this room in the summer heat for that historic event. For the remainder of this program, we're going to put you right here where I'm sitting in the juror's box. But this time you're going to hear the facts about evolution versus creation, not some media spin. So I'm going to expose 10 outright lies, 10 myths that have been fed to the American public by a very small percentage of people and organizations with an agenda all their own. And sadly, many of the rest of us have followed along blindly.
The truth is, evolution relies on blind faith and hoaxes. Those who look into the pages of the Bible find that the mysteries of science have long been recorded there. The truth is, there are no examples of evolution in the fossil record, no intermediate transitional species. Out of the millions of fossils found in more than 150 years, the only thing we see are complete species. The truth is, the missing link between ape and man is still missing because it doesn't exist. The truth is, the world didn't begin with a mindless, meaningless explosion called the Big Bang. The world began when God created it.
Once again, we have the classic scenario. The stage is set. A smart man in a white lab coat with a doctor in front of his name tells us that he has discovered proof positive for what many other smart men in white lab coats hope to be true in order to make their own theories make sense. He tells us he's discovered that life can grow out of non-living chemicals. To those men looking to prove evolution, that's irrelevant, because without chemical evolution, the rest of Darwin's evolutionary model unravels like a ball of string. And along with it, the foundation for everything they've chosen to believe and trust in.
According to evolutionary thought, all life, bacteria, fish, plants, animals, and man, originated from chemical compounds. This theory that life arose from non-living chemicals is called spontaneous generation.
One of the fundamental laws of biology is the law of biogenesis, that life comes only from pre-existing life. And of course, for a creationist, that's certainly no surprise. Life, God's life, created life to multiply after its kind. So that makes sense to a creationist. But to an evolutionist, there was a time in the past when there wasn't any life. And so chemicals somehow got together and made living things, and this was often called spontaneous generation. And there have been some enormous problems faced in trying to get a group of chemicals to come to life. A few years ago, Stanley Miller did a famous experiment. He took some simple materials, some methane, some ammonia, some water vapor, zotzed them with an electric spark to simulate lightning flashing back and forth in the atmosphere of the ancient Earth. And in just a week, he got amino acids, the building blocks of protein. And that was hailed as almost making life in a test tube. And that was one I used when I used to teach evolution. But I took a look at the rest of the evidence. And there are three problems with that brilliant experiment. One, he had the wrong starting materials. Two, he used the wrong conditions. And three, he got the wrong results. Other than that, it was a brilliant experiment.
Do you know what most people just aren't aware of? Most people aren't aware of the fact that scientific experiments, like the Miller experiment, that have been the very basis of evolutionary science for years and years, have all, one by one, fallen like a house of cards. People are just not aware that every last one has proven to be either a complete error or an outright hoax. And the reason most people aren't aware is because the big successful discovery gets front page coverage, and when it's proven false, gets the back corner in the classified section, or no coverage at all. But that's what some men were looking for, some proof that such an absurdity of science and logic could exist. In fact, many scientists' entire careers, including the research funding that pays their bills, weighs in the balance. And with that stage set, along comes Dr. Miller and his famous experiment. Lo and behold, he appears to create life from non-living chemicals. And what happens? What always happens. Front page news, cover stories in medical and science journals, and very impressed academic, scientific, and general public audiences.
I believe humans evolved to where we are today from single-celled organisms based on the theory of Darwinism and natural selection. I don't think that there was any sort of divine intervention.
I believe evolution is pretty much a proven theory.
I don't believe in a higher order. Just because the fact that I haven't seen any, proof proof or concrete evidence of that, and until somebody shows me that there is, then I'm going to have an aversion to organized religion, and I'm going to stay on the basis of chemical evolution.
But do you want to know the rest of the story? The story that never seems to get quite as much press? Well, listen closely, so you'll be able to actually see the fraud coming the next time there's a big discovery that proves evolution.
The Miller experiment assumed an atmosphere of methane and ammonia, gases that could not have been present in large amounts because the ammonia would be decomposed by ultraviolet light, and methane should be found stuck to ancient sedimentary clays, but is not. Miller also left out oxygen because he knew that oxygen would destroy the very molecules he was trying to produce. But as deep as we dig, we find oxidized rocks, suggesting an oxygen-rich atmosphere. Miller also used the wrong conditions. He used an electric spark to combine the gas molecules. The problem is that the same spark that puts amino acids together also tears them apart, and it's much better at destroying them than making them. The main product of the Miller experiment was tar, a nuisance in organic reactions. Trace amounts of several amino acids that make up the proteins in living things were also produced. The problem is that Miller's experiment produced both left-handed and right-handed amino acids. Only left-handed amino acids make up the proteins of life, and just one right-handed molecule prevents their production. What Miller actually produced was a poisonous brew that would destroy any hope for the chemical evolution of life.
You might say, well, if what I've just said is true, what about all the evolutionists that believe in this? Well, interestingly enough, the evolutionists would agree with me. There was a time I was at a debate at San Diego State University. I was just in the audience, but two friends of mine, Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. Dwayne Gish, were doing the debate for the creationists, and at the end, someone in the audience noted, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're privileged this evening. We have in our audience Dr. Stanley Miller." And Gish had explained why Miller's experiment would not produce life from non-life. And so the person asked Dr. Miller, "Would you like to respond to what Dr. Gish said about your experiments for chemical evolution?" And Dr. Miller said, "No." He hasn't believed in that for decades. He knows all of those same problems.
I would say this: any theory on the origin of life on the Earth, or any other planet as far as that's concerned, is a fairy tale.
A fairy tale, pure and simple. Life from non-life, apart from God's direct intervention, is a fairy tale. But despite that obvious truth, evolutionists continue to build their supposedly scientific case on a foundation that virtually rules out everything that follows after it.
Evolution teaches that energy, such as lightning or heat, plus matter, can occasionally create new life. Yet our entire food industry rests on the fact that this can never happen. If we examine a jar of peanut butter, it contains matter and is exposed to light and heat. But we never find new life inside unless an outside life contaminates it. The case for chemical evolution only weakens when we consider that long chains of specific amino acids, all in exactly the right position, are required to form the proteins of life. Even worse, amino acids do not naturally link up to form proteins, but rather tend to break down.
Now, proteins can be 2,000 or 3,000 amino acids long, very long, complex chemicals. And they're very much like a computer program. Every amino acid has to be in exactly the right position. If one of them is wrong, then the whole protein is useless, just like a computer program.
The improbabilities buried in Darwinism start right at the very beginning. Even before life began, how did the first protein molecule come about? And there's been quite a bit of work done on this to investigate the probability of it, work both by information theory technologists and also by molecular biologists actually tinkering with proteins to see whether or not they can be taken to pieces and reassembled. And the work of both groups has found that the probability of a protein of this sort of size that you find in the human body coming about by chance is so great as to be virtually impossible. It's something which is, yes, it is possible if you have eternity at your disposal, but Darwinists just don't have eternity at their disposal.
Information theory scientist Hubert Yockey calculated, and MIT biologist Robert Sauer confirmed, that the probability that a protein containing just 100 amino acids would form spontaneously is less than 1 chance in 10 to the 65th power. An event so improbable that it could be compared to winning the state lottery by finding the winning ticket in the street, and then continuing to find the winning ticket in the street every week for 1,000 years.
The origin of the very first animal life out of ordinary complex chemicals is so large that no evolutionist has ever been able to overcome it, and it is one of the biggest barriers to the theory of evolution that I know.
Do you see the point of all of this? Life, even life at the simplest possible cell level, is so complex, so intricately engineered, and purposely designed so that wherever life does exist, it's virtually a fantasy to say that it could have come from random chemical evolution. Life can only be created by a supreme creator, God himself.
The truth is, life can only come from life.
I don't know about you, but I remember being told in school that the Earth was 1 billion years old. Now they say the Earth is 4 billion years old. Haven't been out of school that long. But all kidding aside, that's the serious problem evolutionists face, as modern science catches up with the countless theories that have been carelessly thrown out as factual over the years. Evolutionists face yet another dilemma. True science has proven that life is extremely complex. In fact, infinitely more complex than their evolutionary theories have accounted for. So, with the increase in complexity, more time was needed to allow for their supposed evolution to take place. So they tried to solve the problem by adding years, sometimes even millions of years, to account for the huge amount of time it would take for such complex variations to develop. As science discovered new complexities, scientists were forced to concede that there was no way such complex creatures could evolve so quickly. And rather than surrender to the inevitable conclusion that evolution simply makes no scientific or even rational sense, they tried to solve their problem by adding more time to their calculations. And it keeps getting more ridiculous. First thousands of years, then millions, then tens of millions, now hundreds of millions, which is one of the many embarrassing reasons why our science textbooks keep changing. By the way, the Bible has never needed changing, never needed upgrading. It's always been proven by science and archaeological evidence to be 100% accurate. But even the strategy of adding millions of years won't help evolutionists, because eventually they'll have to face the same problem that just won't go away. Who made life in the beginning?
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth.
We've all heard about the great discoveries of dinosaur bones and about how they've been dated to be millions of years old. So that proves the Earth is at least that old, doesn't it? Not in the least. Because the media and evolutionists leave out a few more facts here as well. For years, carbon dating was believed to be the best way to accurately date artifacts. But recently, experts have discovered it's not as accurate as evolutionists would like you to think. For example, carbon dating indicated live snails had died 27,000 years before. But scientists now know that carbon-14 dating is only useful for estimating things which are thousands of years old, not millions or billions. It works well on things like cloth or wood, but it doesn't work well on mineralized fossils or rocks.
You cannot date using carbon-14 into the millions of years. Carbon-14 is only good realistically in the span of human history, really, and into the thousands of years.
And carbon-14 isn't the only faulty dating system. Scientists radiometrically dated the lava dome of Mount St. Helens, which erupted in 1980. The results, even though the lava was less than 20 years old, the test showed it was 3 million years old. Obviously, bad science.
The truth is, scientists have never developed a reliable technique to test whether anything, including the Earth, is billions of years old. And the oldest fossils have only been legitimately dated to about 6,000 years. So how old are dinosaurs? Can we know?
Were they roaming the earth millions of years before man, or did they coexist with man? Ken Ham, a former science teacher who now heads up the organization Answers in Genesis, explains.
People don't think about the fact that creationists and evolutionists all have the same evidence. We have the same fossils, the same animals, the same plants, the same dinosaurs, the same world. In fact, I always say to evolutionists, everything you observe I agree with. And I agree with your science. I agree with natural selection and mutations. You know what the difference is? The difference is not the evidence. The difference is the history you believe to interpret the evidence, to put it in an overall context. Now, there's lots of information like that that we can share with people to show them the Bible explains dinosaurs. And we know what happened to them. They died. But lots of animals have died. What's the mystery? It's only a mystery if you believe in millions of years. And by the way, did you know up in Alaska there's a deposit of bones on the North Slope of Alaska that are dinosaur bones that have not fossilized? Even evolutionists are puzzled by this. How could they have lasted for 65 million years and not fossilized? Even if they'd been frozen up there, and they are frozen, evolutionists don't believe they were frozen for 65 million years. You can hold them in your hand and throw them up and down. They're very light. I think that erases 65 million years of history. In Montana, scientists, secular scientists, looked in a T-Rex bone, and part of it was unfossilized, and they found and confirmed, and we have the photographs of them actually, red blood cells. Those bones could not be millions of years old, not at all. Red blood cells wouldn't last that long. No, there's a lot of evidence like that that just flies in the face of the millions of years. And again, it's the Bible that explains what happens to the dinosaurs.
Biologist James Hall explains what he discovered.
In 1989, we were invited by a homeowner out in Colorado who said that he had a dinosaur on his property, and what we found was literally amazing. It went against everything that I was taught in the textbooks. All the labs put them into 6,500 to 7,000 years when you put the correction on them, which verifies Scripture, which says that humans and dinosaurs and everything that you see living, we're all here together. So the earth is not billions and billions of years.
Now, when you start with biblical history, you can make sense of dinosaurs. They lived beside people. They got on Noah's Ark. They came off Noah's Ark. They've died out since, like lots of animals. There's really no mystery. Extinction is the rule on this earth because sin and the curse has affected the world.
But the results go against the secular scientific teaching that dinosaurs are millions and millions of years and never coexisted with humans. Of course, Scripture says that dinosaurs and humans were here together.
In Utah and other places in the world, you see paintings and carvings done by indigenous people that look like dinosaurs. Even evolutionists admit that. It's fascinating information. Even a painting of a flying creature that looks like a pterodactyl in Black Dragon Canyon in Utah, where you find bones of pterodactyls. And they even have this creature with a crest on its head like a pterodactyl. You find dragon legends all over the world.
I found dinosaur footprints alongside of human footprints, and together in the same age rock, and they were only, maybe 10 or 12 inches apart. And I began to see those repeated. And then I began to see some artifacts found in those same layers. For example, we found an iron hammer that was embedded in this dinosaur age rock.
And some of the old history book descriptions fit descriptions of dinosaurs. Interestingly, in the Bible, dragons are mentioned a number of times. The Hebrew word for dragon in the Old Testament, if you replace it in most instances with dinosaur, it fits quite nicely. So the word dinosaur is a modern word. It wasn't invented till 1841. People often say to me, well, the word dinosaur is not in the Bible. And I say, well, the word email is not in the Bible either. In the book of Job, chapter 40, verse 15, it talks about behemoth, the largest land animal God made. It says in verse 19, the chief of the ways of God, the largest land animal He made. The description of it is of an enormous beast and has an enormous tail like a cedar. Now, some Bible commentaries say it was an elephant or a hippopotamus. Well, I've never seen an elephant or a hippopotamus have a tail like a cedar. I've spent all day at zoos getting photographs of rear ends of elephants and hippopotami just to compare them. And the hippopotamus has a little flap of skin, and the elephant has a little reed hanging down there behind. And we think that's a cedar? Not at all. I think that description is a description of a dinosaur.
The truth is, fossil evidence shows dinosaurs are only about 6,000 years old and lived at the same time as man.
Our eighth lie about evolution deals with the myth surrounding what's called natural selection and random mutations. And here's the heart of the issue. Evolutionists say the human eye was formed due to random mutation that occurred in one of the first fish. Could have come from, they say, a sunspot or some similar blemish. And that blemish evolved over time through natural selection. The fish with the best chance of survival mated with the other mutant spot fish. That's known as survival of the fittest. And eventually, the spot grew and evolved into the human eye as we know it today. To the average person, that sounds reasonably plausible. In fact, many scientists seem to accept it on face value because it sounds so good. And it does sound plausible, at least until you stop to think it through. Well, Wernher von Braun, the genius who started the U.S. space program, was director of NASA and did just that. He thought it through. And when he did, it only increased his high regard for his creator.
The idea of creation is not conceivable without invoking the necessity of design. One cannot be exposed to the law and order of the universe without concluding that there must be design and purpose behind it all. To be forced to believe only one conclusion, that everything in the universe happened by chance, would violate the very objectivity of science itself. What random process could produce the brain of a man or the system of the human eye? Wernher von Braun, founder of the U.S. space program and former director of NASA.
And that's the question I want to focus your attention on for a moment. How is it that evolutionists and many others have never stopped long enough to really consider what they're choosing to believe is that the human eye developed over time by random chance? There are countless ways to show you just how absurd the theory is that suggests that random chance mutations evolving over time could actually account for the development of the human eye. But let me give you just two. A quote from Charles Darwin himself. He admitted the eye was a challenge to his theory. Darwin wrote,
"To suppose that the eye, with all its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree."
Secondly, to give you just a very small idea of how ridiculous it is that most evolutionists believe the eye was a mutation that somehow developed over time into the complex thing that it is today,
it's impossible for the eye to evolve by chance or mutations, because everything would have had to have evolved at the same time, which suddenly functioned in perfect harmony. For the eye to function, it must be clean and moist with tear glands and movable eyelids. The cornea has to be transparent to allow light to pass through it to the pupil. A lens then adjusts and focuses the image on the back of the retina, where 130 million light-sensitive rods and cones transform the light into electrical impulses. Those impulses go to the brain, and we see an image. The eye either functions as a whole or not at all. It is either perfect or perfectly useless.
In other words, each function of just the human eye, not to mention the rest of the amazingly complex human body, rely on the fact that for just one part to work, hundreds of other parts had to work at the exact same time. And even knowing that much, it may still sound plausible on first pass that a spot became a blemish and a blemish became an eye over time. But the mathematical odds that the lens and the retina and the tear ducts and the optic nerve and the cornea and literally countless number of other supporting parts all randomly formed at exactly the right place on the body, exactly the right relationship within the eye, at exactly the same time as all the other parts, defies human reason. Even a child could come to the conclusion that to believe that is pure fantasy. And please, when I say even a child could come to that conclusion, I'm not attempting to be condescending. I'm simply saying sometimes we become too smart for our own good. You know, bright, intelligent people face a real danger, pride. And pride can prevent us from thinking simply and purely like children often do. When God-given intelligence that was created to glorify the giver of that intelligence crosses over the line and starts to be used to glorify the man instead of his God, we're now in a very dangerous place. To suggest that such a complex array of perfectly functioning parts accidentally appeared all at once is truly absurd to the highest degree, to use Darwin's own words. Well, you say, evolution doesn't claim it all happened at once. According to the evolutionary model, all this took place over millions of years. First of all, now you know why every year evolutionists have to keep adding millions of years to their projections, how long the Earth has been here. Because the mathematicians who calculate the odds of how long all this complex life would take to develop would blow the evolutionist theories out of the water. As it is, mathematicians have proven evolution is impossible, even in 250 million years. But secondly, to believe all this precise design, such as a complex organ as the human eye, developed randomly, even over millions of years, simply by random chance and by accidental mutations, you would have to believe the following. You would actually have to believe that all by itself, the organism accidentally developed a cornea, which is the transparent portion of the body that can allow light to enter into the area near the mind. But in order to function as part of the body, the cornea needs to be made up of living tissue. For that living tissue to exist, this creature would have to simultaneously and accidentally develop a system to run the blood through it and bring oxygen and water and immunizations against disease to the rest of the eye. That requires blood cells and blood vessels, and that would block the line of sight. So this creature now, according to the evolutionary model, accidentally develops not only the necessary blood cells and blood vessels for the eye, but accidentally develops a special gland that accidentally secretes a special fluid that just happens to carry what the blood carries to do all these jobs. The problem is, the fluid on the eye presents another problem, similar to what happens when rain gets on your windshield. It blocks your view. The solution? Something that can act like a windshield wiper. Since the transparent liquid needs to be there to do its job, we now need something to accidentally develop, to evenly distribute the clear liquid across the cornea. So guess what? An eyelid accidentally developed. It just happens to be made out of the same material that perfectly protects the eye in all kinds of conditions. And it accidentally works automatically. And get this, not just one of these amazing evolutionary string of coincidences occurred, but two eyes, formed perfectly right next to each other, and all by accident, of course.
It's hard to accept the evolution of the human eye as a product of chance. It's even harder to accept the evolution of human intelligence as the product of random disruptions of brain cells in our ancestors. Robert Jastrow, astronomer and geologist, founder of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies.
You get the picture? You can see how absurd Darwin's theory is in practice. And I'm just talking about the most basic functions of the eye as an illustration that this kind of random accidental development of the human body parts had to go on literally millions of ways all over the body, all without a designer, and all quite simply by accident. To believe that, you would have better luck believing that a Harrier jet could develop itself from airplane parts lying in an open field over time, without any intelligent life form to design the parts, or how they would go together. You can believe that if you want, but you shouldn't call that science.
The kangaroo, when the young is born, it's like a little red jelly bean. It's about half an inch long, and it has a mouth, and it has two legs. It has no eyes. It can't see. If you can imagine a red jelly bean with a mouth and two legs, and it comes out of the birth canal, and then it knows where to go, what to do, and how to do it, and it crawls up the pouch. And then it knows where to go, what to do, and how to do it, and it crawls into the pouch. Then it knows where to go, what to do, and how to do it, and attaches itself to its mother's milk to develop from there. I don't know. I could not imagine that happening by chance random processes over millions of years. I think it's designed to do what it does do. And that's really what an animal is like. It's got all these parts all together at the right place at the right time. I couldn't imagine it happening by chance random processes. But the wombat is intriguing. It's also a marsupial. It has a pouch. But the intriguing thing about the wombat is that its pouch faces backwards. And so the young have to jump in at the rear end. Now you might wonder, why is that so? Well, a wombat tunnels under the ground. If you can imagine what would happen if its pouch faced forward, it would fill up with dirt and you get fossilized wombats real quickly. I remember taking a group of American tourists to one of my favorite parks in Australia where the park ranger was giving a talk about the wombat. He said, isn't evolution wonderful? Over millions of years it slowly turned that pouch around. And one of my tourists put up his hand and said, excuse me, sir, what was happening in the millions of years while it was still turning around? And the park ranger had this funny look in his face and didn't know what to say.
That all the adaptive structures in nature, all the organisms which have existed throughout history, were generated by the accumulation of entirely undirected mutations, that is, an entirely unsubstantiated belief, for which there is not the slightest evidence whatsoever.
The truth is, our human bodies are far too complex to have slowly evolved. Parts of the body, like the eye, can only function because everything was created at the same time by an intelligent designer, God.
I can't get past the evidence of you.
That, of course, is the impression a lot of our children may have today, that anyone who's actually a scientist would never believe in the creation model of human life described in the Bible over Darwin's theory of evolution. In movies like the one in which we began this program, and countless other television programs, magazine and newspaper articles like it, have certainly done a good job in brainwashing the public into thinking that.
I was committed evolutionist for some 27 years. Never even knew anything about creation. And what I found was different completely than what I was taught in the textbooks. And so I began to find fossil evidence that disputed the evolutionary viewpoint. And I kept searching, became excited about that, and my whole life began to change.
I'd like to be remembered as one of the biologists in the last century and a half which spoke out against the theology of Darwinism. I profoundly believe that this explanation is not the complete explanation for biological phenomena. And I am absolutely certain that this will be acknowledged universally at some time in the future.
The reason why evolution succeeds in society today is not because of the science, because I was doing science and I saw it wasn't working. What I see, though, is that it was suppressing the truth, it's suppressing data, suppressing science that actually contradicts the beliefs and the ideas of evolution. So evolution survives because of censorship.
I don't think secular scientists will ever dump the idea of evolution per se. I certainly would say that Darwinian evolution has some problems that many secular scientists are starting to recognize. For instance, there was a book written by Dr. Michael Denton, who's not a Christian, he's not a biblical creationist. There was a book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, and he pointed out the problems with evolution.
Throughout most of the last century, there have been a large number of leading biologists like Grasset that have never accepted the Darwinian explanation of evolution. Indeed, on the continent of Europe, probably until shortly after World War II, you could say that the majority of biologists were not Darwinian evolutionists.
As a geologist, I believe the evolutionary model. We evolved and therefore we don't need God because we've evolved over millions of years from some primordial ooze, and so there was no need for God in my thinking, in my world, and I was successful as a geologist and successful as a businessman, so who needed God? I was able to accept the whole evolutionary geological lie, I guess, because I've been deluded. I've been totally deluded. As a geologist, now I believe God's word is true.
It wasn't just me who renounced evolution, it was my family. My brother, who's a doctor, my sister, who's also a doctor, my dad, of course, is a doctor, and all of which have come to realize that God is the architect of the universe, the creator of all things.
There's a stigma in the major universities, and you probably go underground in your secular universities and keep your position quiet, because if you don't, you get fired. I know some of my trusted colleagues who did not follow that, and as a result lost their great positions. And in fact, the opposition is very, very strong. I mean, it's very emotional. I mean, they'll just come after you, to try to get you to change your viewpoint, or they'll fire you.
To Dr. Richard Lumsden, former professor of biology at Tulane University and Medical School and the former dean of the graduate school, evolution was science, whereas creation was merely religion. And he taught as much to his students.
What I would try to get across is that science is science. Science deals with the real world, with real phenomena. We don't bring into such discussions inferences of supernatural.
Dr. Lumsden, who studied at Tulane, Harvard, and Rice, couldn't believe it when the Louisiana State Legislature passed a law that if evolution were taught in the public school classroom, then equal time had to be made for creation science.
My reaction to that was just total consternation. Who are these people telling us
PhD level scientists how to teach and what to teach regarding science. So I just thought the whole thing was just absolutely absurd. But it was not the energy of a supernatural nature. I was prompted at that point to give a lecture on the origin of life, giving creation its due with as much mockery as I could summon. Truly, in the beginning was the Word, but the Word was hydrogen.
After that class, one of his graduate students came up to him and said,
"Great lecture, Doc." Well, that got my attention. Flattery always did. And she said, "But I have some questions." And indeed she did. She had a legal pad, and I could see line after line after line after line.
So they had an appointment, which ended up lasting longer than anticipated. The appointment also ended up changing Dr. Lumsden's life.
Now, I'm not trying to challenge anything. I just want to get my science straight.
That's fair enough.
Okay.
That's fair enough.
Last month, you taught how mutations were genetic disasters. How by natural selection can they randomly produce new and better structures?
That's a good question. Good question. I'll probably have to think more about that.
Okay, well, aren't the odds of the random assembly of genes mathematically impossible?
You've had your share of mathematics. Let's see if we can't figure that out. Not only were we talking about a mathematical impossibility, we were talking about a physical and chemical impossibility, which gave me pause. Genes, that might be 10 to the 200th, 10 to the... Those are pretty formidable odds, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
But the fact remains is that we're here. And in reality, the only way we could have gotten here is through the evolutionary process. So the fact that we're here really proves evolution, doesn't it? And these are the events, molecular events, genetic events, that were mechanisms part and parcel of the evolutionary process. I could buffalo a student when I felt myself get a little bit in trouble, okay? I'd had a few years' experience at this, okay? It's a trade secret. But for the first time maybe in my life, in explaining various facets of evolution theory, I began to listen to what I was saying. And what I was saying wasn't making very good scientific sense.
Where exactly in the fossil record is the evidence for progressive evolution? The transitional forms between the major groups?
You know, most of them, come to think of it, are fully formed kinds in their own right. This conversation with the young lady went on for approximately 3 hours, during which time, again, we entertained these questions, and the whole time I'm answering, I'm listening to my own responses and trying not to betray this to the student. Was rapidly concluding that this is not making good scientific sense. What I'm telling this young lady and what I told the students this morning is not good science. So far, I guess we just haven't been lucky enough to pick up the critical evidence. It dawned on me right then and there that evolution was bankrupt as a scientific theory. Well, if that were so, if life did not originate by a naturalistic, materialistic, spontaneous process, what was the alternative explanation? Oh my God. And I said it then, not in blasphemy, but in awe. What happened that afternoon was, first of all, a mortal embarrassment to me as a professor. Professing to be wise, the professor was made a fool. And then secondly, with the realization that, hey, God exists and God created, was that experience of fear. Now that's enough to turn a corner in anyone's life.
After much study and soul-searching, Dr. Lumsden became a creationist first, and then a Christian.
One event led to the other. And the culmination was finding myself before saving altar, on my knees, that stiff neck broken, in obedience, asking Jesus to come into my life, to be my Lord and personal Savior.
Dr. Richard Lumsden, former evolutionary professor, went on to become a committed creationist because of the scientific evidence. He even went on to debate evolutionists. Unfortunately, this champion of creation science died recently, but not without first leaving us his important conclusion that in light of the great advances of science in the 20th century, evolution is no longer tenable.
The evidence of science, the best in paleontology, the best in biochemistry, the best in genetics, and so on, is all compelling for creation. Creation theory does not rest on some purely metaphysical principles. It rests on the same science that evolution theory would rest on, except that the better explanation is creation, not naturalistic, materialistic, stochastic, or random evolutionary process.
But the fact of the matter is, it is Bible-believing creationists who gave us science as we know it today. A lot of people would be surprised to find out that the founders of almost every single branch of the sciences was a creationist. The greatest minds in science have always been those who understood the biblical account of life to be true and accurate. You don't believe me? Well, take a look for yourself, because the list we're about to display contains the names of the men who established the various disciplines of science that are practiced today. And every last one was a Bible-believing Christian. So I think you'd have to agree to say, as some naive people actually do today, that creationists and people who believe and trust in the Bible as the Word of God are somehow unscientific and uneducated is absurd, since it was the Bible-believing creationists who created science in the first place.
The truth is, Bible-believing scientists were the ones who laid the very foundations of science by making virtually all of the greatest discoveries in scientific history.
That's what they'd like you to think. If you were left to the conclusions drawn by evolutionists, you would think that evolution was almost single-handedly responsible for all moral, intellectual, and scientific good that exists in the world today. But let's look at the rest of the story, as radio host Paul Harvey would say.
Karl Marx, an atheist and the originator of communism, was delighted to find a scientific rationale in the theory of evolution, which he claimed gave validation to his new philosophy. Marx admired Darwin, and the two communicated and corresponded. In appreciation, Marx even attempted to dedicate his greatest atheistic work, Das Kapital, to Darwin.
There were communists of the day, and Karl Marx was one of these, who saw Darwin's theory as giving scientific credibility to what was previously merely a philosophy. The philosophy of socialism, the philosophy of communism, it all became scientific and credible with Darwin's theory.
In the Bible, Romans chapter 1 warns us about the natural consequences of rejecting God the Creator. It results in man becoming involved in wickedness and moral corruption.
If there is a moral governor in the universe, then each person in this universe is responsible to that moral governor. The easiest thing in man's mind to do is just to dismiss the possibility of that moral governorship.
Adolf Hitler used the Darwinian thesis of natural selection, the survival of the fittest, to weed out who he considered to be the inferior strand of humanity. He brutally tortured and killed 12 million people, 6 million Jews and 6 million non-Jews. In effect, we are doing the same thing today with abortion, euthanasia, and infanticide, weeding out those whom we consider to be unwanted persons. Since 1973 in the USA alone, nearly 25 million unborn human beings were killed by abortion. That is one baby every 20 seconds. If we deny that man is created in the image and likeness of God, then we lose the dignity and purpose of life. If we agree with the evolutionary premise that we are no more than evolved animals, then humankind loses all moral perspectives.
Without world religions and governments advocating evolution's principles to prop up their own beliefs, secular humanism and communism would unravel at their very core. That's because each one is built on the premise that man is the captain of his own destiny, and that he doesn't need to answer to a world created by a creator God. Another impact this supposedly beneficial theory of evolution has had in recent times is the advancement of something Shirley MacLaine helped to make popular, the New Age movement. That's a complex network of all kinds of philosophies and political actions, but they all share the same basic goal of what they describe as global oneness, both physically and mystically. Once again, on the surface, anything that promotes unity seems to be a good thing, but it gets very bizarre very quickly. The New Age movement, using the same principles of evolution, just carries the principle out to its logical conclusion, which is to see the next phase of man's evolution to be the development into godhood. They see the human race as a transitional form between apes and God.
I think that man is evolving into a state of higher awareness, higher consciousness, higher vibration. And I think that the best representation that we have of man's movement in that direction is what's going on in the consciousness movement, New Age movement.
Evolution is going on all the time. Many people believe, and I believe, that the purpose of life is to grow, and that you grow as much as you can in each lifetime. And of course, we believe in reincarnation.
Evolution, whether it's biological, chemical, or spiritual, is man's way to explain away God and his creation and put man in the place where only God himself belongs, in control. Christians have been lulled to sleep on this issue. Evolution has even gained ground within the church because so many are unaware of just how far-reaching and dangerous this philosophy is. Not only is God's character and truth at stake here, but the very foundation of morality. If we can remove God from the equation, we're accountable to no one, and we can become our own gods. If there is a moral governor in the universe, then each person in this universe is responsible to that moral governor and his rules. So the easiest thing in men's minds who are trying to do away with the rule over their lives is to just dismiss the possibility of moral governorship. In a phrase, to say there is no God.
The truth is, evolution has inspired brutal, atheistic governments because it ignores or minimizes God as creator. With God out of the picture, evolution has left many people hopelessly searching for the real meaning to their lives.
We started this program over here, in the jury box. We've presented a lot of compelling information, but there actually comes a time in some trials where the evidence in favor of one side is so strong, so overwhelming, that the attorneys with the ironclad case ask the judge for what I'm now going to ask you for, a summary judgment. A summary judgment means that the judge agrees that your case is so compelling and your opponent's case so weak that the case is thrown out for lack of evidence. I ask you now for your summary judgment on the case of evolution. I petition your own judgment, your own conscience. Throw out the case of evolution. Surely if ever a summary judgment was in order, it is this case. And for most of you, the information we looked at here is more than enough for you to render just such a verdict. But human nature being what it is, a few stubborn holdouts always remain. Some will try and argue that despite the overwhelming facts against Darwin's theory, the case is uncertain. But in the final analysis, this is not a case about convincing your intellect. No, God is very clear on that point. You see, God gave you and me a conscience. Then he gave us an entire universe that speaks of order and design, and unimaginable complexity. And that speaks undeniably of a creator.
I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give of the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. He who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. Revelation chapter 21, verses 6 and 7.
Evolution is a lie, and the fact that you and I are created by and responsible to a creator God is an obvious fact. So really, now I'm talking to those holdouts who consider themselves to be scientific and intellectual. This is really not about convincing your intellect. It's about setting aside your pride and listening to your conscience And it's mostly about bending your knee to the Creator God of the universe. It's about submitting to and learning about God through the Bible that He gave to man to reveal Himself. So don't let the evolutionist fool you. Deep, deep down, even in an evolutionist's heart, he knows all too well the truth that God created him and the universe. But his pride and his sin won't let him admit it to himself or you. Evolution is nothing more than an elaborate path that some men have devised to suppress the truth so they can run away from God.
Call unto me, and I will answer you, and show you great and mighty things which you do not know. Jeremiah chapter 33, verse 3. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of His hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the world. Psalm 19, verses 1 through 4.
Don't let men who are suppressing the truth by their wickedness rob you of the glory and blessing of knowing and living for and being blessed by the God who created you. I'm Janet Folger. May God bless you and keep you.